Hello and welcome to another edition of Theology and the Book of Mormon. Um, the purpose of these videos, as you may recall if you've seen one of them before, is not to give a complete description of the branch theology I'll be discussing, but to ask a what-if question about each theological debate and how it would have been changed if those participating in it had had access to the Book of Mormon. I think it's kind of an interesting what-if question. Today I've chosen a topic that is very much alive in current Christianity. In Protestantism, there's a significant debate going on between two branches of Protestantism that are called, the two types of theology are called Dispensationalism versus Covenant Theology. Now, for those who are familiar with the terminology used in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, might be confused by this. This dispensationalism is not equivalent to the word dispensation as used in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Let's get that clear at the outset. But it is true that dispensationalism comes from about the same time in history. So we will consider the other branch, the Covenant Theology, as beginning much earlier than that. It's sort of being the default. And then in the 1830s, a man by the name of John Nelson Darby is credited with having started this school of theology called dispensationalism. Now, there's much that could be said about the difference between dispensationalism and covenant theology relative to the millennium and rapture and other things like that. I am going to only discuss one issue, which I feel to be the most important, and others may disagree with me, but I think it's kind of the defining difference, and ask what the Book of Mormon says on the subject. So the view from the covenant theology side, and both these, I should say, are ways of looking at the Bible, about the history of God's dealings with people through the ages. Covenant theology suggests that throughout time there have been groups of people that God has identified as being His people, and for many centuries that we read about in the Old Testament, those people were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the Israelites, the house of Israel. But that changed in the Christian period, that such that in the modern day, the period that they call the church era, God's people are defined as those who believe in Christ, and if you are a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that doesn't matter anymore. And that troubled this man, Darby. So in the 1830s, he began to argue, and his followers began to develop this theology of dispensationalism. And what their main point was to say, look, if you read the Old Testament, there's a lot that is said about the house of Israel in the last days. It's not the case that we can throw away everything that was said about Israel in the Old Testament. There's clearly more to be said, and so we have an oversimplification here. Now, how they handle that is something I'm not going to get into a lot because I don't feel I'm qualified to say very much about it. What I would like to do is say, what does the Book of Mormon tell us about the house of Israel in the latter days and how that relates to God's people? All right. So, to begin with, let me remind you, if you're not familiar, that the Book of Mormon begins in Jerusalem with some people who are Jews, they're Israelites, Actually, technically not Jews, they're descendants of one of the other tribes, but that doesn't matter. They left Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, the destruction of Jerusalem, in fact, and traveled across the ocean to somewhere in the New World. We don't know exactly where. So they are very much interested in the prophecies about what will happen to the house of Israel in the end, because here they are separated from the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that promised land of Israel. And so it becomes a major theme in the Book of Mormon. So, in fact, I'll mention tangentially, there was another branch of Christianity that the Messianic Jews have their own view on this, which I am not qualified to go into in great detail, but they lay great weight on the statement of Paul about something about Gentiles being grafted into the tree. Interesting enough, that's where we're going to pick it up with the Book of Mormon, because in the Book of Mormon is, this thing that Paul says about being grafted into a tree, an olive tree. He says that as though his listeners ought to know what he's talking about, not just about olive trees, but that analogy is one they must be familiar with. And I don't know if that's true, but at least the people in the Book of Mormon were familiar with that analogy through a prophet whose records we don't have in the Old Testament, but apparently predates the Book of Mormon. So I'm going to begin by quoting a little bit from that. This is if you have a copy of the Book of Mormon, this is in Jacob chapter 5. And he's explaining, this prophet, his name is Zenos, and he's explaining the history of the world and the history of the house of Israel by making an analogy or using an allegory of an olive garden, an olive grove. So I'll pick it up in verse 3. For behold, thus saith the Lord, I will liken thee, O house of Israel, unto a tame olive tree, which a man took and nourished in his vineyard, and it grew and waxed old and began to decay. Now this period is usually seen by the decay of the tree, seen as the time leading up to, before the Savior, perhaps around the time of the Nephites, the destruction of the first temple, at the beginning of the Book of Mormon. Don't know exactly, but that is what it's usually interpreted as. And so as the house of Israel has fallen into wickedness, as we read about in 2 Chronicles, for instance, reject the prophets and so on and so forth, then here's what the plan is in terms of this analogy or this allegory. So the tree waxes old and begins to decay. And it came to pass that the master of the vineyard, which we take to be God, went forth, and he saw that his olive tree began to decay. And he said, I will prune it and dig about it and nourish it, that perhaps it may shoot forth young and tender branches, and it perish not. And it came to pass that he pruned it and digged about it and nourished it according to his words. And it came to pass after many days, it began to put forth somewhat a little, young and tender branches. But behold, the main top thereof began to perish. And it came to pass, the master of the vineyard saw it, and said unto his servant, It grieveth me that I should lose this tree. Remember, the tree being the house of Israel here. Wherefore go and pluck the branches from a wild olive tree, and bring them hither unto me. And we will pluck off those main branches which are beginning to wither away. We will cast them into the fire, that they may be burned. And behold, saith the Lord of the vineyard, I will take many of these young and tender branches, and I will graft them whithersoever I will. And it mattereth not, if it so be that the root of this tree shall perish, I may preserve the fruit thereof unto myself. Wherefore I will take these young and tender branches, and I will graft them whithersoever I will. Take thou the branch of the wild olive tree, and graft them in the stead thereof. And these which I have plucked off, I will cast into the fire and burn them, that they may not come to the ground of my vineyard. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with how olive trees work, they work basically like apple trees. You may or may not know that you've probably never eaten an apple that was grown from a seed. And or at least, or let me put it another way. If you were to take a seed from an apple that you eat and plant it, grow a tree, the fruit that would come from that would not necessarily resemble the apple that it came from, which is surprising to people. But apple trees are universally grafted. You take two different species of apple trees and you cut a branch from one and graft it into another, and so you get this kind of Frankenstein kind of thing. And people have discovered over the years that produces a larger and juicier fruit. The same thing is true of olives. So people learned centuries ago that if wild olive trees produce little tiny olives without very much fruit or juice to them. But if you cut a branch from one and graft it into another, then that will be accepted, that sort of a transplant, like an organ donation, you might say, and the result will be larger, juicier fruit. And so what is happening in this allegory is the master of the vineyard has this house of Israel, and he says, tree's not doing very well, so here's what I'm going to do. I am going to take some branches from another tree, which he calls a wild olive tree, and I'm going to graft it into this tree. And I'm going to take branches from this tree and graft it in somewhere else to some other olive tree. Okay? So very familiar to people who, as the Israelites would have been, to the growing of olives. In terms of religious history, the way we might interpret this is that as the house of Israel began to decay, think about when Christ came, that some of the house of Israel believed Jesus and some didn't. And so what did the Lord do? Well, after they had preached the house of Israel for a while, the Lord said, begin to take the gospel to Gentiles, which they had never done before. They'd never even contemplated. Peter was kind of surprised to get this revelation. And Paul talks about himself as being the apostle to the Gentiles. And so that is when the branch from the wild olive tree, being the Gentiles, begin to be grafted into the tame olive tree. And that's what Paul had reference to when he was talking in the New Testament, to this same story, we think. But the story has another part, that the branches from the tame olive tree, from the house of Israel, would now be taken somewhere else in the vineyard, be grafted in somewhere else. And this chapter actually is quite long. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but the upshot is that it does work, that this begins to be a good thing. Not only the house of Israel that has Gentiles grafted in, that begins to work and produce the better fruit, but also these other areas where the Lord has taken from the house of Israel to somewhere else in the world, and numerous other places, not just one other tree, and grafted in, that there begins to be good fruit there also. So what we learn from that is that it was part of the Lord's plan to scatter the house of Israel. Now we know that even previous to the writing of the Book of Mormon, most of the 12 tribes, there's 10 of them, had been scattered. What we call the kingdom of Israel had already been conquered, and the people carried off into other parts of the world by the Assyrian army. It was as a response of their rebellion against the Assyrian Empire. And so that we also see as being related to this allegory. So Israelites being taken somewhere else, and rather than interpreting it as some Christians have, saying, well, then that's it for that house of Israel, instead this is part of the Lord's plan, that this would be a good thing for them and for the places they're being taken to. So, further on in Jacob chapter 5, after a long time, it begins to be a problem again. The fruit begins to not be good, and so the Lord does one more round of this transplanting and grafting, and brings some of those branches back into the natural tree. And so let me read from, so this was well known to the people in the Book of Mormon, this story, this chapter. And one of the early prophets named Nephi talks to his brothers about what it means for them and their descendants. Because remember, they are now living somewhere else, or they're heading somewhere else. This is while they're still on their journey. So what does this mean for us and our descendants to be separated from the rest of the house of Israel and from the lands that have been promised to Abraham? So in 1 Nephi chapter 15, Nephi says to his brothers, "Behold, I say unto you, that the house of Israel was compared unto an olive tree by the Spirit of the Lord which was in our father." That is, their father just told them this story. "And behold, are we not broken off from the house of Israel? And are we not a branch of the house of Israel?" Now, their father, his name was Lehi, he was a prophet, had told them the story, apparently from this same allegory, and explained how it related to the Gentiles, and they had not understood it. So Nephi is explaining it. "And now the thing which our father meaneth concerning the grafting in of the natural branches through the fullness of the Gentiles is that in the latter days, when our seed shall have dwindled in unbelief, yea, for the space of many years and many generations after the Messiah shall be manifested in body unto the children of men." So this is in what has been called the church era, so well into the modern times. "Then shall the fullness of the gospel of the Messiah come unto the Gentiles, and from the Gentiles unto the remnant of our seed. And at that day shall the remnant of our seed know that they are of the house of Israel, that they are the covenant people of the Lord. And then shall they know and come to the knowledge of their forefathers, and also the knowledge of the gospel of their Redeemer, which was ministered unto their fathers by him. Therefore they shall come to the knowledge of their Redeemer and to the very points of his doctrine, that they may know how to come unto him and be saved. And at that day will they not rejoice and give praise unto their everlasting God, their rock and their salvation? Yet that day will they not receive the strength and nourishment from the true vine? Yea, will they not come into the true fold of God? Behold, I say unto you, yea, they shall be remembered again among the house of Israel. They shall be grafted in, being a natural branch of the olive tree, into the true olive tree." So the point here is that in the Book of Mormon is teaching us that the falling away of the house of Israel is not the end of the story of the house of Israel in the history of God's dealings with his people, but that the Lord has in mind a way to gather those descendants again. This is a little bit distinct from the way it's described in dispensationalism. Dispensationalism describes there being a future for the house of Israel that is distinct from Christianity, and that the promises will come to them, and there will be a difference among them at the rapture, and so forth. That's not what's going on here. So the Book of Mormon suggests, no, the house of Israel, the promise that the Lord made to them, will be fulfilled in that they will be gathered. And that it's not the case that the Lord has nothing to do with the house of Israel anymore. Instead, he has planned for them to be gathered in the sense that they will learn who they are and learn the covenant that was made with their fathers. Let me make a few other statements about the scriptures, sort of to give some perspective here. The John Darby, some of the things he was thinking about the Old Testament does seem to say that in the latter days there is something for the house of Israel. So let me read, for instance, from Isaiah 49. And the Lord is making promises to people there, and seems to go right in the face of what the Covenant Theology people had said, that is, the Lord has done with the house of Israel. And here in Isaiah 49, if we interpret it as being in the latter days, which is not clear that that is, but that is the view of the dispensationalists and the view of the Book of Mormon. Here's what Isaiah said: "But Zion said, The Lord hath forsaken me, and my Lord hath forgotten me. Can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? Yea, they may forget, yet will I not forget thee. Behold, I have graven thee upon the palms of my hands. Thy walls are continually before me." And then he goes on to say that there's going to be something done for the house of Israel. And notice the similarity here to what Nephi just described to his brothers. Thus saith the Lord God, I will lift up mine hand to the Gentiles, and set up my standard to the people, and they shall bring thy sons in their arms, and thy daughters shall be carried upon their shoulders. So the story seems to be, at least to say, if we interpret it, we might not have known without the Book of Mormon what this meant. But in light of what the Book of Mormon said, it seems that what is being said here is the Lord is saying, I have not forgot the house of Israel, but in the day that the house of Israel has dwindled in belief and doesn't understand who they are, or doesn't believe in the Messiah that I've sent to them, then I will gather them. And how will I do it? I will gather them through the Gentiles. So there being two groups of people. There are people who know they're of the house of Israel. Today we would call them Jews, who did not believe in the Messiah. That's one group. Second would be the people who do not know they're of the house of Israel. They're descendants of these people who've been scattered. Both the people the Book of Mormon refers to as living in this the New World, and Israelites who live throughout the world, who were scattered by the Assyrians and taken throughout their empire. And their empire was vast, and so covered what they considered all of the known world. Therefore, the view that we get from the Book of Mormon is that the house of Israel is not forgotten by the Lord, but will be gathered in the sense that they will come to the knowledge of Jesus Christ and of his gospel through the Gentiles. And more than that, that the Gentiles will be grafted into the house of Israel, that those Gentiles who believe in Jesus Christ will be considered as though they were of the house of Israel, whether or not they biologically were or not. Anyway, that's what the Book of Mormon has to say on this issue. And I hope you've enjoyed this segment of theology in the Book of Mormon. I'll see you next time.